The morning sun peeked through the small window of their apartment as 10-year-old James carefully unfolded the cream-colored envelope. His eyes widened as he read the fancy handwriting inside. It was an invitation to Bradley Thompson's birthday party, the same Bradley who lived in the biggest house in town and whose father owned half the city's businesses. "Mama, look!" James called out, waving the invitation. His mother, still wearing her cleaning uniform from her night shift, walked over with tired but loving eyes. "What is it, baby?" she asked, taking the card from his hands. As she read it, her eyebrows rose in surprise. The Thompsons lived in Hillcrest Manor, the neighborhood where she cleaned houses twice a week. She'd never been to the Thompson mansion, but she'd heard stories about its grand hallways and crystal chandeliers. "Can I go, Mama? Please?" James asked, his voice filled with hope and uncertainty. His mother hesitated. She knew how different their world was from the Thompsons. Their tiny two-bedroom apartment could fit inside the Thompsons' garage. But she also saw the excitement in her son's eyes, the same eyes that had seen too much disappointment for a 10-year-old. "Of course you can go, sweetheart," she said, pulling him into a hug. "It's good to make friends from all walks of life." The next Saturday arrived faster than James expected. He stood in front of the cracked mirror in their bathroom, adjusting the collar of his best shirt. A hand-me-down from his cousin that was still a bit too big. His mother had ironed it 3 times to make sure it looked perfect. "You look handsome," she said, smoothing down his hair. "Just be yourself, okay? You're just as good as any of those kids." But as their old car pulled up to the Thompson mansion, James felt his confidence shrinking. The house was enormous, with tall white columns and a fountain in the front yard. Expensive cars lined the driveway, Mercedes, BMWs, and even a shiny red sports car that probably cost more than his mother made in 5 years. "I'll pick you up at 4, his mother said, squeezing his hand. "Have fun, baby." James walked slowly up the stone pathway, clutching his wrapped gift, a book about space that he bought with his saved allowance money. At the door, a man in a black suit looked down at him with raised eyebrows. "Name?" the man asked. James Wilson," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The man checked a list and nodded. "Right this way." Inside, James felt like he'd stepped into another world. The ceiling seemed miles high, and everything sparkled, from the marble floors to the giant crystal chandelier hanging above. Children in designer clothes ran around, their laughter echoing through the halls. "Oh, you made it." Bradley appeared, wearing a brand-new video game t-shirt that James recognized from the store window he passed every day. "Come on, everyone's in the game room." As James followed Bradley, he couldn't help but notice the differences. These kids had the latest smartphones, expensive sneakers, and talked about vacations to places he'd only seen in books. He touched his second-hand shirt self-consciously. In the game room, children were scattered around various activities. Some played the newest video games on a screen bigger than James's entire bedroom wall. Others were showing off their latest gadgets. James stood awkwardly near the door, not sure where to go or what to do. "Hey, that's James from school," one boy whispered to another, not quite quietly enough. "Doesn't his mom clean houses?" James pretended not to hear, but his cheeks burned. He wished he could disappear, wished he'd never come to this party where everything reminded him of what he didn't have. But then his eyes caught something in the corner of the room, something that made his heart skip a beat. There, gleaming under the soft lights, stood the most beautiful piano he'd ever seen. Its black surface reflected the room like a mirror, and its keys seemed to call out to him, reminding him of happier times, of gentle hands guiding his fingers, of a voice he missed more than anything in the world. Without thinking, James took a step toward it, then another, drawn by memories and longing. He didn't notice the room growing quieter. He didn't see the other children starting to watch him. All he saw was the piano, and all he felt was the pull of music in his heart. James couldn't take his eyes off the piano. It was nothing like the old beaten-up keyboard he had at home. This piano was magnificent, polished to perfection, with ivory keys that seemed to glow under the soft lighting. As he moved closer, memories flooded his mind. He remembered his grandmother's gentle hands on his shoulders as she sat him down at her church piano. "Music is in your blood, child," she would say with a warm smile. "Let it float through your fingers." Those Sunday afternoons were his favorite. just him, Grandma, and the beautiful sounds they created together. Lost in thought, James didn't realize he was now standing right in front of the piano. His hand reached out, almost on its own, fingers hovering just above the keys. The room had grown strangely quiet, but James didn't notice. All he could think about was how much he missed playing a real piano. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Bradley's sharp voice cut through the silence like a knife. James jumped back, his heart racing. He turned to see Bradley storming toward him, face red with anger. "Don't touch that," Bradley shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's a Steinway grand piano. It costs more than your mom makes in a whole year." The words hit James like a punch to the stomach. All the other kids had stopped what they were doing and were now staring at him. Some were whispering, others giggling. "I bet he doesn't even know what a piano is," snickered a girl in a designer dress. "Maybe he thinks it's a big table," another boy laughed. James felt his face burning with shame. He wanted to run, to hide, to be anywhere but here. His hands started to shake, and tears threatened to spill from his eyes. But something inside him, maybe it was his grandmother's voice in his head, or maybe it was his own pride, made him stand his ground. I know what a piano is," James said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "Oh, really?" Bradley crossed his arms, a mean smile on his face. "Prove it then. Play something." "I dare you." The room erupted in laughter. Kids were pointing, making jokes, enjoying the show. They all assumed James would embarrass himself even more. After all, how could a poor kid from the other side of town know anything about playing such an expensive instrument? James looked at the piano, then at the mocking faces around him. He thought about walking away, about letting them win. But then he remembered what his grandmother always told him: when words fail, let the music speak. Taking a deep breath, James turned back to the piano. His hands were still shaking as he sat down on the polished bench. The laughter grew louder. "This is going to be good," someone whispered. "Get ready for some noise," another voice said. James closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the cruel words and laughter. He placed his fingers on the keys, feeling their cool, smooth surface. In his mind, he was back in his grandmother's living room, her voice guiding him. Then he began to play. The first notes of the melody floated through the air, soft and clear. It was a simple tune at first, one his grandmother had taught him when he was just 6 years old. But as his fingers found their rhythm, the music grew more complex, more beautiful. The laughter stopped abruptly. The whispers died away. Even Bradley's mocking smile began to fade. James's fingers danced across the keys with growing confidence. He wasn't just pressing random notes, he was creating music, real music. The melody filled the room, touching something in everyone who heard it. It was as if the piano had been waiting for him all along. Some of the kids' mouths dropped open in surprise. Others exchanged confused looks. This wasn't what they expected at all. The poor kid they'd been making fun of was playing the piano like he'd been doing it his whole life. In the kitchen, Mrs. Thompson was arranging party snacks when she heard the music. She froze, a plate of cookies in her hands. That wasn't just someone playing around, that was real talent. Curious and amazed, she hurried toward the game room. As the music continued to flow from James's fingers, something magical was happening. The cruel laughter and mockery were being replaced by something else entirely: wonder, respect, and the dawning realization that they had all been very, very wrong about the quiet boy from the other side of town. As James continued playing, his fingers moved faster, more confidently across the keys. The simple melody transformed into something extraordinary: Beethoven's Für Elise. Each note rang out crystal clear, filling the massive game room with music that seemed to touch everyone's heart. The children who had been laughing moments ago now stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. The girl in the designer dress who had mocked James earlier slowly lowered herself onto a nearby chair, her mouth hanging open. Even the boys who had made jokes about him, thinking the piano was a table, were now completely silent, watching in awe. James didn't notice any of this. He was lost in the music, in a world where nothing else mattered. His eyes were closed, and a small smile played on his lips as his fingers danced across the keys. This was where he belonged. This was who he really was. Bradley stood near the piano, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. He had been so sure that James would embarrass himself, that he would prove to everyone why kids like him didn't belong at parties like this. But instead, James was making his expensive piano sing in a way Bradley himself never could, despite years of forced lessons. The music grew more complex, and James transitioned smoothly into a Mozart piece, one that even professional pianists found challenging. His small hands stretched to reach difficult chords, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. It was clear to anyone watching that this wasn't just talent, this was passion, love, and years of dedication all pouring out through his fingertips. Mrs. Thompson reached the doorway of the game room and stopped dead in her tracks. The plate of cookies in her hands nearly slipped to the floor. As a former concert pianist herself, she recognized not just the difficulty of what James was playing, but the emotion he was putting into every note. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. She had heard many children play the piano, including her own son during his reluctant lessons, but this was different. This child wasn't just playing notes, he was telling a story, sharing his soul through the music. It reminded her of why she had fallen in love with the piano in the first place many years ago. The other parents who had been chatting in the living room began to gather at the door, drawn by the beautiful music. They whispered among themselves, wondering which professional Mrs. Thompson had hired for the party entertainment. "Who is that playing?" one mother asked. "I don't know, but they're incredible," another replied. James moved into the final movement of the piece, his fingers flying across the keys with such speed and precision that it seemed impossible for a 10-year-old. The music built to a crescendo, filling every corner of the room, reaching into every heart present. As he played the final notes, letting them hang in the air like golden threads, James slowly opened his eyes. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then he noticed everyone staring at him, the children, the parents, Mrs. Thompson. His heart started racing again, but this time it wasn't from fear or shame. Mrs. Thompson was the first to move. She walked slowly toward the piano, tears streaming down her face. "That was absolutely beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Where did you learn to play like that?" James looked down at his hands, suddenly shy again. "My grandma taught me," he said softly. "She used to play at church. She said music was a gift from God, and we should share it with everyone." "Your grandmother must have been an amazing teacher," Mrs. Thompson said, kneeling down beside the piano bench to be at eye level with James. "How long have you been playing?" "Since I was 5, James replied. "But Grandma passed away 2 years ago." "Now I practice on an old keyboard I found. It doesn't work very well, some keys don't make sound anymore, but I try to practice every day." The room remained silent as everyone absorbed this information. The children who had mocked James earlier now looked at their feet, ashamed. Bradley's face had turned pale, realizing how wrong he had been. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "You mean to tell me you played that perfectly on a broken keyboard, without proper lessons for 2 years?" James nodded, not understanding why everyone seemed so surprised. To him, playing piano was as natural as breathing. It was the one thing that made him feel whole, especially after losing his grandmother. Mrs. Thompson stood up and looked around the room at all the stunned faces. Something had shifted in the air. The atmosphere of mockery and judgment had been replaced by respect and wonder. And in that moment, she knew exactly what she needed to do. Mrs. Thompson gently placed her hand on James's shoulder, her eyes still glistening with tears. "Tell me more about your grandmother," she said softly. "She must have been very special." James's face lit up at the mention of his grandmother. "She was the best," he said, his voice warm with memory. "She played piano at First Baptist Church for 40 years. Everyone loved her music. She said that music could heal broken hearts and bring joy to sad souls." "And she taught you everything she knew?" Mrs. Thompson asked, genuinely interested. "Yes, ma'am. Every Sunday after church, we would sit at her old piano for hours. She taught me to read music before I could read books properly. She always said I had a gift." James paused, his smile fading slightly. "After she passed away, I promised her I would keep playing, no matter what." "But you mentioned you only have a broken keyboard now." Mrs. Thompson pressed gently. James nodded. "I found it next to a dumpster behind the music store downtown. Some keys don't work, and it doesn't plug in, so I use batteries. but it's better than nothing." He hesitated before adding, "Sometimes, when the church is empty, I sneak in to practice on the real piano. The pastor caught me once, but instead of getting angry, he gave me a key. He said Grandma would have wanted it that way." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Several parents wiped their eyes, moved by James's story. The children, especially those who had mocked him earlier, looked uncomfortable and ashamed. Bradley, who had been standing silently nearby, finally spoke up. I didn't know," he mumbled, his face red with embarrassment. "I'm sorry I was mean to you." Mrs. Thompson turned to her son. "Bradley, do you understand now why we shouldn't judge people before we know their story?" Bradley nodded, looking at the floor. I thought because his clothes weren't expensive, because his mom cleans houses. I thought he couldn't be good at anything important." "And what do you think now?" his mother asked. "I was wrong," Bradley admitted, "really wrong. James is amazing." Mrs. Thompson smiled at her son's honesty, then turned back to James. "You know, I used to be a concert pianist," she revealed. "I performed all over the world before I had Bradley. But I haven't heard anyone play with such heart in a very long time." James's eyes widened. "You were a real concert pianist?" "Yes, and I still teach a few advanced students," Mrs. Thompson continued. "James, how would you like to take lessons with me? Proper lessons on this piano." James's mouth fell open. But I can't afford lessons. Mom works 2 jobs just to pay our rent." "I'm not talking about money," Mrs. Thompson said firmly. "I'm talking about nurturing a gift. You have something special, James. Something that shouldn't be wasted on a broken keyboard in a tiny apartment. Will you let me help you?" James could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You mean for free?" "Not free," Mrs. Thompson smiled. "In exchange, you'll practice hard and share your gift with others, just like your grandmother taught you. And you can come here anytime to practice. This piano deserves to be played by someone who truly loves music." Tears welled up in James's eyes. He thought about his grandmother, about the promise he'd made to her. He thought about his mother, working so hard to give him everything she could. And now this unexpected kindness from someone who, just an hour ago, had been a stranger in a world he thought he didn't belong to. "I would like that very much," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Bradley stepped forward then, extending his hand to James. "I'm really sorry about before," he said sincerely. "Can we start over? Maybe we could be friends." James looked at Bradley's outstretched hand, then at the faces of all the children who had witnessed his transformation from an outsider to someone remarkable. He took Bradley's hand and shook it firmly. "I'd like that," James smiled. Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands together. "Well, now that's settled, who wants to hear more music while we have cake?" A chorus of yes filled the room, but this time the children weren't just being polite. They genuinely wanted to hear James play again. As James sat back down at the piano, surrounded by his new friends, he felt his grandmother's presence so strongly it was as if she were standing right beside him, smiling with pride. Sometimes, he thought, the worst moments can lead to the best surprises, and sometimes all it takes is a little courage to show the world who you really are. As the children gathered around the piano for cake, Mrs. Thompson quietly stepped into the hallway and made a phone call. She spoke in hushed tones, but her voice carried a sense of urgency and excitement. After a few minutes, she returned to the party with a warm smile. The afternoon passed in a blur of music and laughter. James played several more pieces, each one drawing more applause and admiration from his new audience. Even the parents couldn't believe their ears. This young boy from the other side of town was playing like a seasoned professional. Around 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Thompson hurried to answer it, and moments later, James heard a familiar voice that made his heart skip a beat. "James, baby, are you okay?" It was his mother, still wearing her cleaning uniform, her face etched with worry. She had received Mrs. Thompson's call asking her to come to the house immediately, and fearing the worst, she had rushed over from her job. "Mama." James ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Everything's fine, better than fine." Mrs. Thompson approached them, extending her hand. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm so glad you could come. Please, don't worry, James is perfectly fine. In fact, he's more than fine. He's extraordinary." James's mother looked confused. I don't understand. You said it was urgent. Come with me, Mrs. Thompson said gently, leading them both to the piano. There's something you need to see. As they entered the game room, all the children fell silent. Mrs. Thompson nodded to James. Play something for your mother, sweetheart. Show her what you showed us. James sat at the piano once more, glancing at his mother's puzzled face. Then he began to play, this time, a piece his grandmother had written especially for him, a lullaby she used to sing when he was small. His mother's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes. She recognized the melody instantly. It was her mother's song, the one she had hummed while cooking, while cleaning, while putting James to bed as a baby. As James played, his mother sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed with emotion. She had known her son could play, of course, but she had never heard him like this. Working 2 jobs meant she was rarely home when he practiced, and their broken keyboard could never produce such beautiful sounds. When the last note faded away, Mrs. Thompson turned to James's mother. Mrs. Wilson, your son has a remarkable gift. I used to be a professional pianist, and I can tell you with certainty that James has the potential to go very far with proper training. I know he loves music, his mother stammered, wiping her eyes. But lessons are so expensive, and with rent and bills. That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Mrs. Thompson interrupted gently. I would like to offer James free piano lessons twice a week. He can practice here on our piano whenever he needs to. No charge, no conditions, except that he continues to work hard and develop his talent. James's mother stared at her in disbelief. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us. Mrs. Thompson smiled warmly. Because talent like this is rare and precious. Because every child deserves a chance to pursue their dreams. And because, she paused, her voice softening. I remember being a young girl with a gift for music, and someone gave me a chance. Now it's my turn to pass that kindness forward. Mama, please said yes, James begged, his eyes shining with hope. His mother looked from her son's eager face to Mrs. Thompson's sincere expression, then around at all the children who were nodding encouragingly. Bradley stepped forward. Mrs. Wilson, I was really mean to James earlier because I didn't know how amazing he is. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Please let him take lessons. We all want to hear him play more. Other children chimed in with their agreement. He's the best pianist we've ever heard. Please let him stay and play with us. Overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, James's mother broke down in tears. I don't know what to say, she whispered. This is a miracle. Say yes, Mama, James urged softly. Grandma would want me to. At the mention of her mother, Mrs. Wilson smiled through her tears. You're right, she would. She turned to Mrs. Thompson. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. Yes, we accept your generous offer. The room erupted in cheers. James jumped up and hugged his mother tightly, both of them crying happy tears. Mrs. Thompson watched the scene with satisfaction, knowing she had just changed a young boy's life forever. Oh, I almost forgot, Mrs. Thompson added. There's a citywide youth piano competition next month. With some intensive training, I think James could do very well. What do you think, James? Would you like to enter? James's eyes grew wide as saucers. A real competition. Him. He looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Mrs. Thompson. Yes, please, he exclaimed. I want to make everyone proud, especially Grandma. Little did they know that this competition would be the beginning of something even bigger than any of them could imagine. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of practice and preparation. James spent every possible moment at the Thompson house, his fingers dancing across the keys of the beautiful grand piano. Mrs. Thompson proved to be an incredible teacher, patient but demanding, pushing James to reach new heights while never forgetting to make it fun. Remember, James, she would say during their lessons, music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about telling a story with your heart. Bradley became James's biggest supporter, often sitting quietly in the corner during practice sessions, amazed at how quickly his new friend was improving. The two boys grew closer, finding they had more in common than they'd thought. Bradley even started taking piano lessons again, inspired by James's passion. James's mother adjusted her work schedule to attend some of the lessons, watching with pride as her son blossomed under Mrs. Thompson's guidance. The change in James was remarkable. He stood taller, smiled more, and carried himself with a newfound confidence. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. The city's grand concert hall was buzzing with excitement as families filed in, programs in hand. The competition featured young pianists from all over the city, many of whom had been taking expensive lessons since they could walk. Backstage, James paced nervously in his new suit, a gift from Mrs. Thompson. His mother stood beside him, holding his hand. "I'm scared, Mama," he whispered. "What if I mess up? What if I forget the notes?" His mother knelt down to his level, just as his grandmother used to do. "Listen to me, baby. You've already won just by being here. No matter what happens on that stage, I'm proud of you. Grandma's proud of you. Just go out there and play from your heart." Mrs. Thompson appeared, looking elegant in a dark blue dress. "It's almost time, James. Are you ready?" James nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly. Mrs. Thompson noticed and took them in hers. "Do you know why I chose you for this competition?" she asked. James shook his head. "Because you have something none of these other children have. You play with your soul. You don't just make music, you make magic. Now go out there and show them what real music sounds like." When James's name was called, he walked onto the stage, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The concert hall was enormous, with hundreds of people in the audience. He spotted his mother in the third row, sitting next to Mrs. Thompson and Bradley. They all smiled encouragingly. As he sat at the gleaming grand piano, James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought of his grandmother, of all those Sunday afternoons, of her gentle voice saying, "Music is a gift, child. Share it with the world." Then he began to play. He had chosen to perform an original composition, something no other competitor had dared to do. It was a piece he had written for his grandmother, combining all the techniques she had taught him with the new skills he'd learned from Mrs. Thompson. The melody started soft and sweet, like a lullaby, then grew into something powerful and moving. As his fingers flew across the keys, James forgot about the audience, the judges, the competition. He was back in his grandmother's living room, playing just for her. The music poured from his heart, telling the story of love, loss, hope, and triumph. The piece built to a stunning crescendo, then softened to a gentle, touching final that left many in the audience wiping their eyes. As the last note faded into silence, there was a moment of complete stillness. Then the concert hall erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. James opened his eyes, startled by the response. He saw his mother crying happy tears, Mrs. Thompson beaming with pride, and Bradley whistling and cheering louder than anyone. The judges huddled together, whispering animatedly. The head judge, a stern-looking woman with silver hair, stood up and approached the microphone. "In my 30 years of judging youth competitions," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I have never heard anything quite like what we just witnessed. This young man didn't just play the piano, he touched our souls." James felt his heart soar. Whatever happened next, he knew he had done his best. He had kept his promise to his grandmother and made everyone proud. The head judge continued, "It gives me great pleasure to announce that the winner of this year's citywide youth piano competition is," she paused dramatically, "James Wilson." The audience exploded in applause once again. James sat frozen in disbelief until Bradley ran onto the stage and hugged him, followed quickly by his mother and Mrs. Thompson. Cameras flashed as he was presented with the trophy and, more importantly, a full scholarship to the prestigious City Music Academy. As he held the trophy high, James looked up toward heaven and whispered, "We did it, Grandma. We did it." The morning after the competition, James woke up to find his picture on the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, "From Broken Keys to Concert Stage, Local Boy's Inspiring Journey." His mother had already framed the article, hanging it proudly next to his grandmother's old photograph in their small living room. At school, James was suddenly a celebrity. Kids who had never spoken to him before wanted to be his friend. Teachers congratulated him in the hallways, but what meant the most was that Bradley publicly announced to everyone that James was his best friend, and anyone who had a problem with that could answer to him. The scholarship to the City Music Academy opened doors James never knew existed. He began attending classes with some of the finest music teachers in the country. Mrs. Thompson continued as his mentor, guiding him through the challenges of balancing regular school with his musical education. "Never forget where you came from," she would remind him. "Your gift grew from humble beginnings, and that's what makes it special." James took her words to heart. Despite his growing success, he remained the same kind, humble boy who had walked nervously into Bradley's birthday party months ago. He started volunteering at his grandmother's old church, teaching piano to children who couldn't afford lessons, just as his grandmother had done. A year later, James was invited to perform at the city's annual winter concert, a prestigious event usually reserved for professional musicians. He chose to play a piece he had composed called Grandma's Lullaby, dedicating it to the woman who had started it all. The night of the concert, the auditorium was packed. James's mother sat in the front row, wearing a new dress she had bought with money from her promotion. She was now a supervisor at her cleaning company. Next to her sat Mrs. Thompson and Bradley, and behind them, many of James's classmates and their families. As James walked onto the stage, he wasn't nervous anymore. He belonged here. This was his purpose, his destiny. He sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and placed his fingers on the keys. "This piece is dedicated to my grandmother," he announced to the audience, "who taught me that music is a gift meant to be shared, and to Mrs. Thompson, who believed in me when I needed it most." The music that flowed from the piano that night was unlike anything the audience had ever heard. It was filled with joy and sorrow, struggle and triumph, gratitude and love. When the last note faded away, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes. Years passed, and James's talent continued to grow. He won national competitions, earned a full scholarship to a prestigious music conservatory, and eventually became a renowned concert pianist, traveling the world to perform. But he never forgot his roots. Every summer, James returned to his hometown to run a free music camp for underprivileged children. Mrs. Thompson and Bradley helped him organize it, turning the Thompson mansion into a temporary music school. They called it Grandma's Keys, in honor of the woman who had started it all. One day, during the camp's 5th year, a shy little girl approached James after a lesson. She reminded him of himself at that age: worn clothes, nervous eyes, but fingers that itched to touch the piano keys. "I don't have a piano at home," she whispered, "but I practice on a cardboard keyboard I drew. Is that okay?" James knelt down to her level, tears in his eyes as he remembered his own cardboard keyboard from years ago. "That's more than okay," he said gently. "That's how I started too. Would you like to play something for me?" As the little girl sat at the piano and began to play, James smiled, knowing that the cycle of kindness was continuing. He had been given a chance, and now he was passing it on. Later that evening, at the camp's closing ceremony, James stood before all the children and their families. "Remember," he said, "talent doesn't care about where you come from or what you have. It only cares about what's in your heart. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong. If you have a dream, chase it. If you have a gift, share it. And if someone tries to mock you for reaching for the stars, just smile and keep reaching." The applause that followed echoed through the halls of the Thompson mansion, where years ago a young boy had been mocked for daring to touch a piano. Now, that same piano was helping to launch the dreams of countless other children, proving that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. And somewhere up in heaven, James's grandmother was smiling, her lullaby continuing to change lives, one note at a time.